like to welcome Secretary of State Lisa Nandy and David Olusoga. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh wow, there's a lot of you. So my name's Lisa Nandy and I'm the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport in the new government. And what we're doing here today is, we hope, the start of a much more inclusive national conversation about some of the issues that matter most to people in this country. You're going to see something quite unusual today because I'm not going to be doing most of the talking. Because it's my belief, having worked with young people before I came into Parliament, first at the charity Centrepoint and then at the Children's Society, that people know much better than governments do what needs to change in their lives, in their communities and in their country. They often know much better than we do how to go about making that happen. What they need is a government who walks alongside them every step of the way to help make good on those goals. And that, for me, is how you build a country that really works, where people are in charge of their own destiny, and some of the biggest challenges that we face as a country become challenges that we take on and collectively solve together. And so, thinking about today, we were looking at one of the great challenges that we have, that I hold responsibility for in government, and that is around our incredible creative industries, the envy of the world, some of the most creative, imaginative, brilliant people, and one of the fastest growing industries in the UK as well. But for far too many people, for far too long, they just simply haven't seen themselves reflected in that story that we tell ourselves about ourselves as a nation. And we, as a new government, are determined that that is going to change. But to change it means taking on some of the systemic problems that have prevented that change for far too long. And one of those great challenges is that the people who decide what is made determine the story that is told. But far too many of those people in the creative industries don't look or feel like the country as a whole. And who better, we thought, to talk about cracking that challenge than David Olusoga, who is, well, you all know who he is, but he's one of our most eminent historians. He's one of the most exciting people on TV, in my view, helping us to learn from the past so that we can create a bridge to the future. But he also is a working class man and a black man in an industry, the TV industry, that is one of the least diverse in the world. And he's spoken very powerfully about his experiences and what he believes need to change. Now, David, I thank you, first of all, for agreeing to do this and to be helping us to kick off a far more thoughtful conversation about how we deal with some of these challenges. A few years ago, you gave the McTaggart lecture, which really did send sort of ripple effects around the industry, and, you know, for people like me, was an incredibly powerful moment where you talked about the experience of being in the TV industry. For the audience who haven't seen that, can you just outline a bit what you said in that lecture, and also, do you think anything has changed?
Well, thank you, and thank you for being here. The McTaggart lecture, for those who don't know, is arguably the biggest, most important lecture in the TV industry. It happens every year. I was very flattered and terrified to be given the chance to deliver the lecture. And I gave my lecture in 2020, a year when all sorts of sectors, all sorts of industries were examining themselves, thinking about their diversity, thinking about inclusion. And that was obviously the topic that I wanted to discuss. And what I really wanted to say was that I'm not a poster child for the success of diversity in television. I'm an exception. I'm somebody who happened, partly because I had nowhere else to go and didn't leave. I'm someone who happened to get lucky, and that I didn't want to be framed as somebody who was proof that this industry is doing better than it is, both in terms of race and socioeconomic diversity, because I think we have a very, very deep problem. And I think at the heart of that problem is a question that we've normalized the idea that this is an industry only for some people. A great example of this is a show which I loved, which was Dinner Ladies
Oh yeah.
by Victoria Wood.
Yeah.
And in the second series, there's this is about working class dinner ladies in a canteen. It was one of those great working class programs on British television. And there was an episode when they were going to be the subject, these fictional dinner ladies, of an observational documentary. And the producer, as they were portrayed, was upper middle class. It was a very posh woman. And that's when we're fictionalizing our industry, when it's us doing it in TV drama, we choose to present ourselves quite accurately as upper middle class. We've normalized the abnormal. We don't recognize how unfair it is. And we use it also not just in representation, but in language. That phrase that we use, people from non-traditional backgrounds, when we describe people from working class backgrounds or minority communities who somehow get through the filtering system of television, that speaks, I think, very powerfully to the idea that we think there is a traditional background, that being a television producer or an assistant producer or an editor has some sort of is a sort of almost hereditary position. It's a very telling phrase. There should be no traditional background. There should just be people who have skills.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Do you think it's got better or worse since you gave that lecture 4 years ago?
This is going to sound like a very evasive question. I think it got better, then has got worse, because since that lecture, the industry, like many industries, looked itself in the mirror and began to act in a way that I'd not seen previously. And most importantly, I think people in positions of power in television began to make demands. Institutions began to expect diversity, to make programs qualify, for example, for awards. And some very important people in television, I would pick out Charlotte Moore and Patrick Holland in particular, became champions of diversity. And then we've had, I don't know whether to call it a crash or an adjustment or whatever it is that we're going through. And that means we've had levels of unemployment in our industry that are unprecedented. A huge number of my friends, my colleagues are struggling in this industry at the moment. Now, we know what happened last time. Last time there was a contraction after the 2008-2009 crash, when we again looked at who had survived that crisis, who was still in the industry. What we discovered was people from minority communities and lower socioeconomic backgrounds had left. And I think there's already clear indication that that is happening again, and some of the success of 2021, 22, 23 has been rolled back.
Yeah, so it's an interesting challenge. I was sort of, obviously, since I've become the Culture Secretary, I've had lots of meetings and conversations with the TV industry, and I think it's at least something that is recognised, but progress has really eluded us. And for me, this is existential for TV, because Carol Vorderman was making the point at the Edinburgh Festival earlier this year that if only 8% of people in your industry self-define as working class, but yet around 45% of the country self-defines as working class, and they're the people who most consume traditional TV, is it any wonder then, if they're not seeing themselves and their lives, the sort of brilliant Dinner Ladies example, on the screens, that they're going elsewhere? They're going to streamers. They're going online. And for me, as a Secretary of State, it really worries me, because one of the things that I love about our public service broadcasters in particular is that they tell a national story. And it's a story that we can all feel part of. I often think of the London 2012 Olympic Games and the opening ceremony that the brilliant Danny Boyle led. He's like Victoria Wood, actually. He's also from Bury in Lancashire, which is one of the finest places on earth. Must be something in the water there. But he told a story that we could all see ourselves in and feel a part of, not shying away from the light and dark in our history, and including people in that story. And I worry that what happens is that people move online, and where it's incredibly atomised, where the things that they're consuming are very, very concentrated
and delivered by an algorithm.
Designed to almost reinforce their own views and beliefs and experiences. I say this as if I'm talking about other people. I mean, I'm the same as well. I have these algorithms playing out towards me. And I wonder what that does to the country if we don't get this right.
Well, I think one of the miracles of British television was that it did become the living room, it did become the public space, and I think that's something that's enormously valuable. The BBC being the kind of first miracle of British television, the success and the diversity of the independent sector, the brilliant invention of Channel 4. We did so well at making this the place where we had our conversations. I think one of the problems is that television emerged at a moment when there was lots of socioeconomic, social mobility, I should say, taking place anyway. I mean, we have the cohort studies, the famous studies of large numbers of people at various landmarks in British history, 1953, 1970, and the millennium. And what they show when you look at those three cohorts is a dropping off of social mobility. That was partly because people born in the 1950s arrived in a Britain which television was expanding into, where the middle class itself was expanding. More jobs that we used to define as white collar, using that strange, rather dated language, more middle class jobs were emerging. So television became more meritocratic because the society was becoming more meritocratic. In 1973, Britain was one of the most equal societies in Europe. Britain is now either, so the United Kingdom is now either the most unequal or the second most unequal society in Europe. So I think television has lost that meritocracy, that inclusivity, because the society around it has lost that inclusivity. The other thing, however, though, is that we, because of the nature of what we do, are able to disguise from others and from ourselves the reality. So the example is, if take ethnic diversity. If you go to the BAFTAs, and any year you will see nominations and winners from all different communities and backgrounds. If you go to the craft BAFTAs, the BAFTAs for people who do the editing and the colorists and the set designers and the costume designers, the people who aren't on screen, and notably those awards, both the RTS and the BAFTA craft awards, are not televised. You rarely see non-white people, even in nominations, never mind walking off with a gong. So our public face looks so much more diverse than it really is. I mean, the example, the phrase I always use is that when my programs are on television, it's usually someone with a regional accent as the continuity announcer who is saying now on BBC Two.
Yeah.
I can't remember the last time I pitched a program to a commissioner with a regional accent. So we camouflage the fact that this is an industry inordinately dominated by people from privileged backgrounds, upper middle class backgrounds, very often, disproportionately privately educated. There's also a kind of Oxford and Cambridge dominance of the industry. The kind of one gag I attempted in my McTaggart was to say that TV's idea of diversity is to make sure there's a balance of people from Oxford and Cambridge. It got better laugh here than it did at the should have tried to hear first. So we camouflage from ourselves and from the audience the problems that we have with including everybody in positions of influence, of creativity, by putting the people on screen.
Yeah, you've hit on one of my favourite subjects. I'll try not to get diverted off on a tangent about the importance of moving commissioning power.
Yeah.
But the TV industry has arguably done a huge amount in terms of moving people outside of London, and it does make a difference. Things like Media City in Salford, which has enabled a whole range of new voices to be introduced to television and to the news. It makes a difference when they're picking up the phone, that you're picking up the phone to a professor at Manchester University rather than a professor at King's, because you may well
at
get a
Manchester
different
University, I'm all in favour of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Or a local politician who happens to hail from just down the road, like say Wigan. But there's
that's our career sorted out.
But one of the challenges is that the commissioning power hasn't moved. I think, and it's something we've been talking to the TV execs about.
Well, in my years in television, I've pitched once to a commissioner who wasn't in London. I pitched to Sasha, who's here in Bristol, and that's the only time.
Did you get the commission?
I didn't actually, but
boo.
We'll talk about that later.
So
but that's in my entire career, and I've only once pitched to a non-white commissioner, and that was an American broadcaster.
Wow. Did you get that one?
Yeah.
Well done. So I want to talk about how we fix this, and one of the things that really struck me about your McTaggart lecture was that you talked about the number of schemes that there have been to try and encourage people into the industry. And, we're very keen on that as a government. One of the things that we've just expanded is the Creative Skills Programme, going into schools, helping young people to believe that these industries can be for them, and getting the skills and the contacts that they need to be able to then go on and work in those industries, and we're reviewing the curriculum to put arts and creativity back at the centre, because after 15 years of watching it downgraded and culture erased not just from our classrooms but from our communities as well, I think there are too many young people who just don't believe that this is for them, and we're determined for that to change. But you said something really interesting in that lecture. You said there have been lots of these schemes, but what then happens is you get into the industry and then the culture is the problem. And you talked really compellingly about being told, well, you don't have the experience to go to the next rung. And so you can't ever get the experience to go to the next rung. And so you're stuck. And you talked about Marvin Rees, who's the mayor of Bristol, who's a good friend of both of us, was the mayor of Bristol, who's a good friend of both of ours, who left in the end because of the sheer hopelessness of it. And so much of that you put down to culture. Now, culture is a notoriously difficult thing to change, whether it's in politics, media, or anywhere else. I was wondering, as the historian in you, have you got any thoughts about how you can successfully change culture?
I think very often culture is changed by the society around it. I think one of the reasons why we've failed is because Britain, as I said, is becoming a less inclusive, less meritocratic society in all sorts of ways. But culture can also be affected by policy. It can be affected by the economics of a sector. I think one of the reasons why America is doing better in terms of diversity is that America is on its way to being a majority-minority society. And if you aren't getting African American viewers, 44 million African Americans, if you aren't getting Hispanic viewers, you've lost getting on for half of your audience. So the economics of inclusion and diversity and change are often a key factor in changing culture. But you have to believe that your culture is a problem. And when we have ideas like some people being non-traditional and other people therefore being supposedly traditional, I think that's an impediment to cultural change. There's also the phenomena that sociologists call moral license, which is that sectors and industries that feel that they're doing good are far less likely to scrutinize themselves.
Right.
TV's full of people who really want to make wonderful programs to entertain and inform audiences. We believe we're a liberal sector, a progressive sector. And yet it is the creative sectors, the screen industries, but also the stage industries, the heritage industries, curatorship, that are doing some of the worst, are achieving some of the worst levels of inclusion and diversity in all forms, particularly socioeconomic, but also ethnic. When I go to Canary Wharf, and sometimes I do D&I work for banks and law firms, Canary Wharf looks more like London than any broadcaster does. When I walk off the street into the offices of a broadcaster in London, inevitably, I'm walking off the streets of a city that's 30-40% not white.
Yeah.
I don't reflect that. That is not what happens when you get through those sliding doors. That's not the world that you find yourself in. And we've convinced ourselves that because we're all lovely, liberal, progressive people, that somehow positive outcomes will just happen without any process, without any metrics, without any hiring consultants or putting programs or initiatives in place. There's some sort of magical osmosis, liberal, progressive phenomena will just take place because we're all so lovely. And that's moral license. And it's one of the reasons why it is those progressive areas that are doing really badly. I work in 4 sectors. I work in television, I work in publishing, I write books, I work and I sit on the board of a publisher, I work in newspapers, I used to write a column for The Observer, and I sit on the board of The Guardian, and I work in higher education. They're all doing really badly. TV is off the scale in terms of failing, not just to address its issues about ethnic and socioeconomic diversity, as well as issues around gender and also about disability. It's failing to really recognize that there is a problem. And I think there's part of this, and this is going to sound really, really harsh, is there are a lot of people in television who don't think this is a problem, and they don't think it's a problem because genuinely, though they've learned never to say this, they don't believe that people aren't like them can do what they do. You hear phrases, to talk about geography for a moment, you hear people talking about London producers as if living close to the Thames is some sort of elixir that makes you more creative. And that phrase, London producer, i.e. as a better producer, a more capable, a less risky producer, I think that speaks to an idea that really there's only a small number of people from a small number of backgrounds who are kind of strangely and oddly like the people making the decisions, who can actually do the work. And you have to really believe that everybody, people who aren't like you, who don't look like you, who don't talk like you, who are from backgrounds unlike yours, you have to really believe that they can do what you do. And I think there's people in power in television who don't really believe that.
It's really a fascinating way of looking at it, because so much of what we try to crack in politics is the other side of that, the lack of belief that you can do it, rather than the over-belief that only people like you can do it.
Well, I think we have lots of over-belief in television.
Yeah, it's interesting. Not too different to politics, I think. But can I, sort of, because we've got a lot of young people here today, and one of the challenges is, I find when we talk about these things, is that, just to give you an example, I got elected as the MP for Wigan 14 years ago, and I go into schools a lot in my constituency and talk with young people about politics and how it works and what they want to see change. And I used to always say to young people, to young women in particular, you know, if you've got views and beliefs, if you're passionate, if you can listen to other people and be thoughtful about how you fix things, you absolutely ought to be considering going into politics. And as politics has become much more violent, much more brutal, I've stopped saying that, because I don't think hand on heart that that's good advice for them. And I don't say this very often. In fact, I don't know if I've ever really said it because out loud, because I worry that by acknowledging that all I do is put more good people off from coming in. And if you do that, then the system never changes. And I wondered how you navigate that. I mean, it was a bold thing to do when you did the McTaggart lecture. I think you said it at the start, this may end my career in television. And I think, you know, looking at you on the screen, I think you genuinely weren't sure if it would. Do you worry about us talking as if it's not possible for people from diverse backgrounds to make it, and therefore it becomes a self-fulfilling property? But if the alternative is silence, then, like you said, silence is complicity. So do you have any advice about how to navigate that?
Well, I have exactly the same dilemma. I teach on a documentary course at the University of Manchester, and I stand in front of groups of brilliant, dynamic, thoughtful, intelligent young people, like the young people here today, who all want to make television, make film, make podcasts, make video, and I worry about sugaring the pill and telling them or implying that this industry is going to be more welcoming to them than I suspect it is. And that question about whether you can honestly say that advice, I mean, I think about that a lot. My mother, I was brought up in the 70s and 80s when Britain was a far more equal society, that was going in the wrong direction very rapidly. I was just able to go to university and get a grant, right on the cusp, no tuition fees. And my mother could say, on a council estate overlooking the Tyne, town called Gateshead, I went to the same school as Paul Gascoigne, great school if you want to play for Newcastle, not a great school if you want to be a historian. But my mother could say to her children, work hard, go to university, and you can do whatever you want. And she could say that honestly. I don't think a single parent in a council estate with mixed-race children could honestly say that now. And that is, to me, the biggest indictment of the changes to our society since the 1980s. And I think that has to temper what we say to young people about this industry. But the other side of it is, this is an astonishing industry. These are amazing jobs. There is something about making something from nothing, telling a story, getting your voice out, or getting the voices of the people you interview recorded. You're making history. You're defining and divining your society. It's just an astonishing industry. And so I'd hate to be the person who didn't say, have a go at it. The thing which I do often say is, most things have got worse, but some things have got better. The technology is cheaper, it's more accessible than ever. The gatekeepers have lost control of the gates. Yeah. The biggest broadcaster as of this year is YouTube. Yeah. I mean, the biggest media event of this year was a YouTuber fighting a pensioner. I didn't see that coming. We've had a moment in which the young people that I teach at Manchester, they can edit. I mean, I was in television 10 years before I was ever allowed to edit. I had to borrow cameras from the BBC, and you learn to use them at weekends because you were so discouraged. They are so visually literate. You have access to the means of production, to portray my childhood Marxism. And and there are more platforms than there ever have been. And there's nothing that impresses and kind of gilds your path in television than just being able to go out and do it. It was so difficult to actually make stuff when I was a young person in television, and it's so much easier. So lots of things have got worse, but you have the means of production in your hands in a way that I didn't.
I love the idea of you as a kid, while everyone else is playing with toys, you're sitting there debating Marxism in your head.
There was quite a lot of that, yeah.
It must have been an interesting childhood with Gaza next door. So I wanted to throw this open to the audience, and we've got a couple of people who've already indicated that they would like to ask questions. I can read these out if you like, but is Kerry here? Would you like to do your question, or do you want me to do it? Okay, all right, I'll do it. So Kerry is the founder of an affordable luxury accessory design brand, and this is the question. So how do I say this? Amshella? Amshella, yeah. So Amshella is the name of the brand, and Kerry is the founder. Amshella's social mobility programme is committed to creating opportunities for young people from underrepresented backgrounds to access the fashion industry. In your experience, what strategies or policies could best ensure equitable access to careers in the creative industries, particularly for young people outside of traditional cultural hubs like London? How can smaller organisations and independent brands contribute to this goal? And I think that's probably a question for both of us, is it? So, yeah. Good one.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, please, have a go, and then I can pinch the best bits of what you said.
And I think it's a very similar challenge to television. Most TV production now is independent companies, and very often small independent companies. And there's a lot of pressure on an industry that is, I think it's 16,000 companies across film and television in the UK, smaller companies with not very many employees, to lead the charge on diversity and inclusion in all its forms. I think they need support. I think they need industry organisation to do this. I think any industry and most industries are these days informal and freelance. There has to be some coming together. So as well as all the things that you can do as an individual, and obviously this is something that's close to your heart, hence what you do, I think we also need to campaign for industries and sectors to allow smaller organisations to come together to create a platform that allows for greater diversity, to bring the sort of buying and purchasing power of smaller companies together, to create pathways and to do what we used to do when there were staff jobs, which is to organise careers. Because then we end up with the problem that I discussed in the McTaggart, which is we have lots of young people from working class backgrounds, minority communities, disabled people entering the industry, and they're gone by the time they're in their 40s. They should be the leaders of our industry. They should be the people who would be able to step up and become channel controllers and run broadcasters. They've left. So our problem is not so much drawing people in, it's keeping them and building careers for them.
That's really great. I was just thinking, when you were talking, I went to see an amazing project that the government supports called New Gen, which is about the next generation of fashion designers. And it was incredible, actually, because just with a little bit of support, had massive, massive impacts on the career chances of those young, amazing young designers. You know, just things like being able to access the space to do the runways and to have workshops, and just those things that can take years for an up-and-coming designer to break into. With a little bit of help and support from government and from the industry, you can unlock those opportunities. I think the other thing that for me is that I would never have dreamt of becoming a fashion designer as a kid. It's not, your careers advisor at school doesn't sit you down and say, would you like to be a fashion designer? And I think that for us, that is why arts and creativity at the centre of the curriculum is so important, because just helping young people to understand that there are all these incredible creative careers out there that can really enrich your life. And I'm a big believer that if you're going to spend your life doing something, you really want to do something that you enjoy and is worthwhile, is so important. But beyond a certain age, it's almost like the sort of belief in being able to do that gets beaten out of you, and we're determined to be there at that moment to help young people. Especially because I was thinking when I went to New Gen, the fashion industry is there's something we could learn in politics from the fashion industry. I think in politics we're so reactive to events, whereas the fashion industry for decades now has set the terms of our national story, and these big upheavals that we've lived through, like the recognition of the climate crisis or the AIDS epidemic, all of these things are things where the fashion industry has really grabbed that and shaped the story that we tell about what comes next. And so for the whole nation, having the broadest range of people in that industry is incredibly important. I have another one from Jules. Is Jules here? Hello. Do you want to ask your question or do you want me to do it? I certainly will. Okay, so Jules is a creativist? I can't get the word out. Creativist at Curiosity Unlimited, a youth worker and leader of the Bristol bus boycott campaign. And the question is, the Bristol bus boycott is one of the UK's most significant moments in race relations. Building on its legacy and Labour's plans to introduce a Race Equality Act, how will your department, I think this might be for me, use the 60th anniversary of the Race Relations Act of 1965 as a creative catalyst for meaningful cultural change? I think that's a really great challenge. We obviously have the draft equality bill, which amongst its provisions will introduce mandatory reporting around ethnic minority pay, which will help us, because one of the things that really strikes me about the conversation we've been having about the TV industry is that we don't even have data on ethnicity, let alone on what people are paid and whether that's one of the challenges. This is quite personal for me, so you may or may not know, but my dad was an immigrant to this country in the 1950s from India, and he was in race equality all his life, largely because in those days, you know, if he wanted to find somewhere to live and rent a flat, if he wanted to go for a drink in the pub with his wife, it took a campaign, it took a sit-in to achieve it. And so he was one of the architects of the 76 Act, set up the Runnymede Trust and the Equal Opportunities Commission. And a few years ago, we were talking about the sort of legacy of all of that. And I think he and his generation are quite pessimistic about it. I think they feel that the progress that once seemed inevitable has begun to unravel. And I said to him, what can be done? And he said, well, you've got to understand that progress is not inevitable and that it falls to every generation to pick up the baton and to fight these battles anew. And I think, if anything, their success was part of the problem for my generation, because I, as a mixed race kid growing up in Manchester, I really started to believe that progress was inevitable. You know, one of the greatest gifts my dad's generation gave to me was that I wasn't defined by my ethnicity. And I think we have watched that progress unravel in a lot of ways over the last 15 years. So, you know, if I could say one thing about marking that historic anniversary, it's that I think we should learn from people like David, who help us look back in history so that we can build that living, breathing bridge to where we want to get to in the future. And I think an honest appraisal of how far we've come, how much there still is to do, and a national conversation around that next year would be the right way to mark it. I don't know what you think, David.
Well, I think one of the things we need to do is exactly what Jules is doing, is this is a great pivotal moment in British history that happened here in Bristol. There's a ceremony for the late Paul Stevenson at the end of January next year. He's an absolute British national hero. And I was giving a talk years ago. I write children's books. I was in a school in Bristol about 10 years ago. And the class that they were doing for Black History Month was the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. And
it happened here.
At that point, Paul Stevenson, Roy Hackett, we still have Guy Bailey.
Yeah.
The leaders of the Bristol bus boycott were not very far from that school.
Wow.
And the teacher had never heard of it.
Wow.
Just, you know, absolutely recognising that this was a pivotal event with Bristol at its centre, recognising our own history against racism, against colour bars, rather than focusing a bit too much on, you know, Martin Luther King and civil rights in America, I think would be a really important first step.
It's brilliant. Thank you. And thank you for what you're doing.
Absolutely.
We've got a few minutes. I wondered if anyone in the audience might want to pop up and ask a question, particularly if there's any young people who want to. Yes.
Obviously, you want to do a lot of stuff with the media industry, kind of like make it more equal and stuff. But also, how do you want to make sure that jobs are there is offering jobs in the media industry? How do you plan to make sure they're out there so us young people can get more options and get more like options? Obviously, you want more people with experience over like youth.
Yeah. And are you one of those young people who'd like to work in the industry? Really? Yes. Yes. So I'm glad I haven't put you off that yet. So basically, how do we make sure that young people can get those opportunities? And this is a big challenge, right? Because we've had, obviously with the pandemic, there was a decline in advertising, which hit a lot of broadcasters very hard. You've had the strikes over in America, which have had a big impact on the number of shows that are coming through. And so you've got a lot of people out of work. When we first introduced the minimum wage, one of the reasons that we decided to introduce different rates for younger people was precisely because, I say we, I mean I was at school at the time, but there was a view that if you didn't have a lower rate for younger people, then they wouldn't be able to get into those industries and get those jobs. Actually, the evidence doesn't stack up. It suggests essentially what it's become is just a way of paying less to young people for doing the same job, and so we've made some progress on that. But it is a difficult thing to do. What's your thoughts on it, David?
I think the industry needs formality. It needs procedure. It needs to be. I mean, I've been in television 25 years. I've had 2 interviews for jobs. I've had a lot of chats. I've been for coffee a lot of time.
Yep.
That lack of formality, that lack of career structure, which can exist in freelance industries, other industries can do this. I think that's absolutely fundamental, because too often, knowing somebody in the industry, happening to live in London, having a mate who's in the industry, these informal connections are the keys to getting employment. And I think all of the creative industries need formality. One of the reasons why minority communities are so obsessed with qualifications. I mean, the cliche of the Nigerian is he's doing 15 degrees and he's always a student. The reason for that belief in formal education is because of its formality. Because if you have a degree, you have a PhD, it can't be taken from you. There's no old tie that can get in the way. We have an industry that's almost entirely informal, and we shouldn't be surprised, especially because this was predicted by sociologists when the industry became informal 20, 30 years ago. We shouldn't be surprised that the effect is that certain people have gilded pathways and other people are shut out. We need formality. Other freelance industries create pathways, structures, career progression, and television needs to do the same.
So I know that you don't like being held up as an example of success, and you said in the McTaggart lecture that you saw yourself more as a survivor than as a success story. And I can completely understand why, when there are structural things that we need to grip in order to make sure that you're not the exception. But I do think that having had the pleasure of having had this conversation with you on this stage, one of the most thoughtful people in this area and one of the best known broadcasters in Britain, and being in a position as the Secretary of State to be able to host that conversation, I think what I most want the message to be to this audience, to the creative industries, but particularly to the young people, is that you can do this. And our job as a government and as the industry is to make sure that you don't just have dreams, but that we match those dreams with a plan to help you get there. And that will be one of my absolute priorities during the time that I'm your Secretary of State. So I really hope that you will consider going into the creative industries.
Because we need you.
Because we need you. Because the country needs you, and because the story that we tell to ourselves about ourselves as a nation has got to include everybody in it for the sake of the future of this country. And to those of you thinking about going into politics, that is excellent news. I'm so glad I didn't put you off. I just wanted to say an enormous thank you to David for such a brilliant conversation. It's the start of a national conversation. It's certainly not the end of, this is not me saying job done, we're going away. We are determined to grip this challenge. And I particularly wanted to thank the Bristol Beacon for being such an incredible venue. And on that note, perhaps Sam, you might come and say a few closing words.
Yes, and just to say that I would like to thank both of you for this very important conversation. I feel like we could have spent all afternoon talking about this, and it's a lot for everyone who works in cultural organisations, including me, to be thinking about. So thank you very much for joining us, and please thank Secretary of State Lisa Nandy and David Olusoga. Thank you.
Thank you. That was ace.
Thank you
Thanks
very
so much.
Thank you.
Could have done that literally all day.